Welcome to Sunday morning at the Marxist Library. My name is Sharon and I will be moderating today. In pre-pandemic times, this weekly program was hosted by the Institute for the Critical Study of Society, ICSS, at the Neville Proctor Marxist Library in Oakland. During the pandemic, we have been meeting on Zoom, and today we have a hybrid meeting where I and a few people are here at the library, and the rest of you are all on Zoom. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to our participants from throughout the United States and around the world. I'm a member of the planning committee that organizes these sessions. Also, we maintain the website, icssmarx.org, post on our YouTube channel, ICSS Marxists, and keep our financial records. Al Sargis founded the Friedrich Engels Institute of Marxist War and Military Analysis, an informational outlet at the Neville Proctor Marxist Library. He has made presentations on the military and war, China's economy, political ideology and army, Marxism in US academia, and African-American history. He's also spoken at the Chinese Academy of Military Science, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Tsinghua University, Renmin University, and China's University of Political Science and Law, among others. His articles have appeared in various US and foreign publications. A Marine Corps veteran, he organized sailors and soldiers in anti-war activities during the Vietnam War. Besides China, his solidarity work has taken him to socialist countries in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Caribbean. Al currently moderates Google groups on China and war and the military. He can be contacted at bigalsays@yahoo.com, and we're going to put that in the chat for you. It's bigal, S-E-Z, all one word, at yahoo.com. And now, here's Al talking about the only communist general that the United States has ever had. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Sharon, and welcome to the world. The title is August Willich, the first and the last U.S. Army communist general. However, he was much more than that, and his contributions to communism in the United States, as well as socialism, are not that well known. And I hope to expose you to more about him and more of his contributions so you can see his significance. More well known is Joseph Wiedemeyer, who was Marx's envoy to the United States and also an associate of Willich. This is a rather condensed talk, although you might not think so. I begin with his biography, and then I will expand it here and there to wider aspects of socialism and communism in the United States in the 1800s. He lived from 1810 to 1878, which made him very old then, but he wouldn't be considered that old now. He was born in Brandenburg in East Prussia. His grandfather was an official in the city government, and he was liked so much by Frederick the Great that Frederick made him a lesser noble. So his father comes along, and as a lesser noble, there's only a few kinds of areas in which he could have an occupation, landowner or government administrator or professional of some sort. His father chose the profession of the military, and he became an officer. Eventually, in battle, he was severely wounded and had to retire, but he only survived as a government administrator for a few years before he died. His mother, as Willich's mother, was a Polish stage actress. And when her husband died, she gave young August, who was maybe about 4 or 5 years old at the time, to an uncle. And the uncle happened to be a liberal theologian and philosopher who was very much into the arts and to Enlightenment philosophy and ethics. His uncle saw children as full human beings, worthy of respect and dignity, and capable of teaching adults a few things. He instilled in young August a sense of self-dependence, a clear sense of right and wrong in human affairs, and service to society. At the age of 12, August went off to cadet school for 3 years. And the cadet school was essentially a military school for kids. And he took subjects like French and Latin, math, history, geography, music, and so forth. But the life there was very Spartan. And Spartan at that school meant, how shall I put it? Self-mutilation. For example, in order to prove their boyhood or their young manhood, they would stick needles into their hands and see if they could stand the pain. In any case, after those 3 years, he moved on to a military academy for 3 years. It was the finest military academy in Prussia. Had been started by Friedrich the Great and prepared cadets to become officers. He took typical university courses plus a heavy dose of military science. Eventually, he passed his coursework and his half a year of field work and became an officer and was posted to the Rhineland as an infantry officer. Now, the Rhineland had been a part of Germany that had also been part of France. And so there was a lot of ideas about Enlightenment and a lot of ideas about the French Revolution that permeated that part of Germany. In the Rhineland, the strength of the monarchy and the nobles was less than, say, he'd experienced in Prussia. The monarchy and nobles were being challenged by a rising capitalist class, by workers' upheavals, and by small farmers and peasants who were being displaced and put into factories. As food became scarce and prices rose, there were bread riots, workers' demonstrations, et cetera, To quell this, the soldiers were called in. And hundreds of workers and peasants were killed. And Willich then began to question the role of the military. How could the military serve the people, which was the military ideal, and yet at the same time kill the people when the people had a just cause? As he began to think more and more about this, the government successfully cracked down on the Rhineland demonstrations, and this allowed Willich and sympathetic officers to form discussion groups where they discussed the role of the army, the kind of society that would give the masses their best conditions. They not only studied politics and economics, but they also studied ethics, philosophy, and even poetry for guidance and inspiration. Around that time, Willich was drawn to Hegel, Hess, Feuerbach, and eventually became acquainted with Engels and Marx. Willich eventually concluded that labor was both the moving force of history and the future center of history. The future society would see work in common for the common good. He also became an atheist around that time and a lifelong critic of religion. Now, he was posted back to Berlin and raised in rank and joined the Royal Artillery. For those who know something about the Royal Artillery, they were comprised mainly of working class. It's like the cavalry was comprised mainly of the petty bourgeoisie, and the infantry comprised mainly of peasants. As a side note, when Engels was drafted in 1841, he also went into the artillery because he wanted to be close to the working class. In any case, Willich formed another group of sympathetic officers, among whom included Joseph Biedermeier, who was at that time, I believe, a lieutenant. He grew more, Willich grew more discontented with the role of the army and became a radical who believed in the overthrow of the monarchy and the capitalist class by the working class. He and fellow officers reached the final straw when they failed to reform the army. Willich and some officers tried to go to the king. King wouldn't listen to them. He went to the head of defense, and right away they started to watch Willich as untrustable or untrustworthy. And finally, Willich quit the army in 1843 at the age of 36. He became a carpenter. That is, he apprenticed as a carpenter. And every evening or every day, he would parade in front of his former military base on his way to work and back. He did this as a visible symbol of his rejection of both his class and of his military background. After being involved with various radical groups, he joined the League of the Just and its subsequent transformation into the Communist League. He was solicited by many in Germany for a military overthrow of the monarchy. And in 1848, in the 1848 revolution, he became involved in one of several workers' armies. These armies were led by, quote, generals or political activists who were, how shall I say, lacked military experience. And they sat around beer halls largely discussing how they, as future presidents of Germany, after they overthrew the monarchy and the capitalists, how they would lead the new unified Germany. In any case, Willich formed a small army of about 800 among the various armies to confront the monarchy. Because they were very ill-trained and led, that is, the other units were ill-led. They eventually were defeated by thousands of government and the loyal militia troops. And Willich's group was forced to retreat to France. In 1849, what remained of his troops went back into Germany. They linked up with other proletarian troops and formed a, quote, workers' republic in Baden. At this point, Engels, who had been active in Baden, trying to organize the military, joined the army of Willich and became Willich's second in command. Willich's approximately 800 workers' army was forced to retreat in the face of several tens of thousands of government troops. They formed the rear guard of the retreat of the whole army into Switzerland. And Engels commanded the rear guard of the rear guard. Now, when they went into Switzerland, they found it was very inhospitable to them. The Swiss didn't want all these foreign revolutionary troops around Switzerland. And so Willich went to England. He went to England just several months after Marx and Engels went to England. And because Willich had been associated with Marx and Engels welcomed them. However, this was in London. Willich joined the Communist League with Marx and Engels, but soon differences between them became apparent. There were factions within the Communist League, you might imagine. Plus, there were socialists and communists in other groups, in which there were factions within those other groups. In England, Willich was very well known and very well received in general. But as I said, there was a clash between him and Marx and Engels, and the various groups that Marx and Engels found congenial. At first, the conflict was over how a revolution should be conducted. And the conflict was not political, just political. It also became very personal between Willich and Marx. Marx and Engels believed in building a working class base, conducting struggles for better conditions, and then overthrowing the German monarchy and capitalist class when the opportune conditions existed. Willich, however, believed in immediately forming a workers' army and then invading Germany directly. Now, the conflict was in a few other areas, but that was the basis of their differences. I said it was more than just political, it was personal. And y'all know how everybody says you have to be comradely and polite when you're in meetings. In those days, they were far from comradely and polite. I'll give you just a few examples. Willich called Marx an intellectual midget, a person who was concerned with words and not actions, a bastard, and other terms along those lines. Marx replied in kind. He called Willich a homosexual, which he was not. the way he phrased it in both writing and in words with things like Willich prefers to be in the arms of apprentice tailors rather than the arms of women. So it got kind of testy, I'll put it that way. And it got even more testy when Willich got the majority of the Communist League members behind him and not Marx. In other words, he took the group which generally followed Marx, and some were split off. The majority were split off. As one person said, quote, Marx is respected, but Willich is popular. In a sense, Willich was seen as a man of action, and Marx was seen as a man merely of words. Now, as things deteriorated, Willich, at the impetus of the British government, left for the United States in 1853. The British government was anxious to get rid of these radicals in England, so they offered any communist or socialist full paid trip to the United States plus 6 weeks of provisions. Willich kind of lived hand to mouth in London, so he saw that things, that he wasn't getting very far with all the bickering and so forth. So he goes to the United States. Now, let me give you a little bit context about Willich going to the United States. The Germans, between 1840 and 1860, 1.5 million German immigrated to the United States. About 15,000 of them were communists and socialists who had fought in the revolution of 1848 and 1849. Now, you might not think that 15,000 is very much, but as I'll show you, that their influence was far beyond their numbers. The Germans came to the United States oftentimes as groups, that is, persons with different skills would form a group that were complementary skills that they needed to survive within the United States. Why was their influence more, that is, why were the 48ers influence more than their numbers? Because of, number one, their occupational skills. They were overwhelmingly artisans, craftsmen, and self-employed professionals. Their activities in the United States as journalists, trade union organizers, strike leaders, creators of working men's political parties, and so forth, put them in leadership positions where they could influence Germans who were not, 48ers. Let me give you some examples, more examples of the German influence in the United States. The Germans started the communist leagues in the United States. They started among the first working men's parties. They started communist workers' education associations. They were actively involved as strike leaders, as union organizers. They as strike leaders. They, for example, were leaders in the 1877 railroad strike, which, as you might know, was the first nationwide strike. They formed the early working men's parties. They started, as I say, communist leagues all over the Midwest and the Northeast. They had an influence beyond that because they, that is the 48ers, because they believed in economic, political, social, racial, and gender equality. They began to move in those areas. So, for example, you all heard of kindergarten, right? You all know that's a German name, right? Kindergarten, right? The first kindergarten was started in St. Louis by a communist. Okay? You all heard of pharmacy, right? Okay. They were very interested in, a lot of them were very interested in pharmacy and having pharmacists study chemistry. So what did they do? They started, and I mean there was a socialist and a communist among the 48ers that started the American Pharmaceutical Association. Tell that to your local pharmacist. There were socialist and communist doctors in the American Medical Association, and they pushed through a three-year medical university training, such as occurred in Germany, whereas before that, American, quote, doctors had to attend 1 year of lectures off and on. So that the influence was very widespread, not just politically, economically, but also socially. Now, when Willich came to the United States, he landed in New York City, very well known, of course. And so he helped form the, let me jump back. He spent some time in New York City at first, and then he moved on to Cincinnati, Louisville, St. Louis, and Milwaukee, where he helped form Communist Workers League, communist clubs, labor unions, and labor parties. And also, I might add, in terms of the influence of Germans, the largest group in the Civil War were Germans. 200,000 German immigrants fought in the Civil War. The closest to that were African Americans, were at 180,000, and then it just went down the line. Okay? Now, eventually, Willich moved to New York City and became a draftsman. And he worked for the US Geological Survey. He went to sea for 3 years in that position, and then he settled down for a while in DC. Now, at that point in his life, he began to turn towards dealing with US conditions and putting European conditions and Germany kind of like on the back burner. He began to talk more and more about a socialist republic of the United States. He also, at that time in DC, first began to become involved in the abolitionist movement with free African Americans. In DC at that time, this is just in the late 1850s, that African Americans in DC were twice as many as enslaved African Americans in that city. But he began to explore the abolition movement and got very close to them, so close that one of the women, one of the African-American women who was in that movement, eventually became his partner while he was in DC. Now, he eventually returned after a few years. He moved around a lot, you'll see. He eventually returned to Cincinnati, where he founded and edited the first daily labor newspaper in the United States. He also formed a German-American Socialist working man's organization, which was like a pre-party formation. He also began working more intensively in the abolitionist movement. He worked with the local Black community, and the leader in the local Black community in the abolitionist movement was a person called Peter Clark. Now, there is a book written about Peter Clark. It's called Peter Clark, the First Socialist, which I have not read. Okay, but in any case, they worked together. I'll give you a quick example. After John Brown was hung by the U.S. government, Clark and Willich decided to hold a joint rally. So Blacks and Germans marched through the city into the German area, which is called Over the Rhine, right? Over the Rhine still exists, I might add, and in that neighborhood. So when they got there, they went to a big hall, all right, and the 300 Blacks and whites sat together, and 3 speeches were given. One was by a congregational minister who many regard as an atheist, but anyhow, he gave a talk on John Brown and how righteous John Brown was, but said John Brown should not have become involved in violence. Next, Peter Clark gave a talk. Peter Clark said, well, John Brown showed the importance of abolition, and that it may be necessary at times for the abolitionist movement to engage in violence. Then Willich got up to speak, and standing on the podium, behind which, I might add, there were 3 flags. There was the German flag, the African-American flag, and the American flag. And the American flag was draped in black. So Willich got up and he made a fiery speech, which ended, "Sharpen your sabers, keep your muskets in good order, because that's the only way that the slave owners and their Democratic Party will be abolished." And he got a standing ovation. Of course, he was right? He was predicting civil war. And he got a standing ovation. The newspapers went crazy over this whole thing. They said things like, here you have all these Blacks with these traitorous Germans in the same audience, sitting next to each other, marching with each other. You know, it was like creating a big scandal. It said it was anti-American because it was, after all, Washington and Jefferson were slave owners, right? So obviously it was anti-American. Now, along comes the Civil War. I'm condensing a lot, as I said in the beginning, okay? So along comes the Civil War, and Willich joined a all-German Illinois regiment. He joined as a private, but within a couple of weeks was made a major, and became the second in command. He later, after a year, he later joined actually he formed a all-German regiment in Indiana at the behest of the governor of Indiana. Now, during the Civil War, the units that he was in were involved in 8 major battles from 1862 to 1864 in Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia. After after being wounded twice, once very severely in his arm, he was posted in 1864 back to Cincinnati, where he was in charge of interdicting arms shipments to Copperheads. Copperheads, right? Those were Northerners who sympathized with the Confederacy, as well as interdicting arms to the border state South. In 1865, he led his Indiana German regiment to Texas as part of the Juneteenth troops. He retired in October of 1865 as a major general. And let me briefly go through some important traits I think are important about the 2 regiments that he commanded. First, all officers were elected by the men which commanded them, which they commanded. Secondly, he was a very gung-ho on drill and maneuvers. And this was based on the Prussian military manuals, not the US military manuals. He had a very low opinion of West Point officers, in which most officers were West Point, except those who paid their way to become high-ranking officers. This did not get him, how shall I say, well-liked among some officers. On the other hand, his units were very well decorated. He was commended by General Grant, General Sherman, Abraham Lincoln, and even Robert E. Lee thought that the troops that he commanded were some of the best troops in the Union Army. He called his men his citizens or his children. And this was not in children derogatory, but in the sense of being like a family. All right, he was the father, the troops were the kids, and the troops referred to him as father, or sometimes old man. He wasn't very old, but anyhow. He led from the front, which resulted in him being wounded twice and captured once. He was released in a prisoner exchange after a year. He treated his men very well in terms of their accommodations. Just to give you one example, he had a member of Congress come to his camp one time and eat with him. Okay, so the member of Congress sits down and they start to eat, and the member of Congress said, "Boy, you really have a good meal here. You had like pork chop, salad, vegetables, and fancy pastry plus beer." And he said, you must eat pretty different than the men. He said, no. He said, this is the same thing that the men get. And he said, go look. So the guy goes over to the mess line, and sure enough, the men were eating the same thing that he was. He also innovated many tactics, most of which were not picked up by the US military. I'll give you an example. One of the things he innovated was the 3 lines of troops. Normally you'd have either one line of troop and maybe a second, but his 3 lines were different. They were like spread out. So if you had, here's line 1, here's line 2, here's line 3, right? Now, normally you fire, right? The first line fires, and it takes about a minute to reload. So the Confederates, right, would be reloading, okay? But then line 2 would come up, right? And they would fire, and it really discombobulated the Confederates, right? Because they were busy loading their weapons and assuming that the Yankees were doing the same thing, right? But no, they were firing at them. And then the 3rd line would come up, and they would fire more, right? And the Confederates were just dropping all over the place, and they had the choice of retreating or carrying on a bayonet charge, right? So this happens almost like a machine gun, right? When he was in one of his early battles, they were attacked by the Texas Rangers. You've all heard of the Texas Rangers, right? They had a cavalry regiment, and they were outflanking Willich's men. And Willich in front made some hand signals, and his troops went into a square so that they were covered completely. They defeated the Texas Rangers, and captured Texas Rangers said, this is the first time we defeated the Yankees. He said, usually they're a pushover. And then he found out they were Germans. He said, oh, you're not Yankees. No wonder. Finally, I mentioned that he had a lot of skilled persons in his army. The physicians that he had were trained in German universities. The engineers were trained in German universities. The cooks and other skilled persons that he needed in the ranks usually went to a vocational school in Germany. So that they found out, it was discovered that his engineers were probably the best in the US Army. They could quickly build bridges over water, repair railroad bridges, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it was something that the Army looked at as a model, but never were able to emulate. After the war, he returned to Cincinnati and was involved in forming 2 trade unions, continued his newspaper writing, formed a communist education association, and was elected city auditor. He was pretty bad at being a city auditor. The day-to-day politics, he was just not good at. So he retired at the age of 67, or I should say 66, into a small, predominantly German Ohio town, where he died a heart attack at age 67. Now, his funeral was something that should be mentioned. Because of his notoriety in the United States and around the world, there were 3,000 persons that attended his funeral. Schools were closed. Special trains brought mourners from around the Midwest. The funeral procession, I say was about a mile long. Let me just describe it. The first line was led by, pardon me, his casket was at the head of the line. His casket was carried by communist political comrades. Second behind them were members of the army that had been in his unit. This was followed by political figures like senators, state legislators, local government officials. This was followed by German artists, painters, writers, singers, musicians. And then behind them were school children. And then behind them were citizens in general. Tributes came to him from all over the United States and from all over the world. Now, in conclusion, let me just read from his the only English language biography of Willich, which came out in 2020, fortunately, called Radical Warrior.
Who put it together?
Norma is asking who published it.
Oh, this is published in 2020.
Or wrote it?
University of Tennessee Press.
Who wrote it?
Ran about $23, which was the cheapest copy. Everything was
Oh, we'll put that
into
in
the
the chat.
30s.
We'll put that in the chat later. Go ahead.
Okay.
Al.
So in the final paragraph, it says that Willich argued for a permanent revolution until the final victory of the working class was achieved. He remained loyal to that call from 1848 to the end of his life. Circumstances and environment forced him to change his tactics at times, but his core principles never changed. Indeed, they formed the prism in which everything else was viewed, including the US Civil War. And the US Civil War, he saw as an extension of the revolution of 1848 and 1849, which many of his soldiers also identified with. Encouraging and promoting a solution to the socialism question, he said, is and will remain the only task of my life. This work as a communist alone not only makes life more challenging for me, but in my view, also give it its value. So that's the end of the formal presentation. You might ask why he is not known. And if someone raises that question later, I'll give my opinion. But thank you.
Richard, you can leave the camera there because she can be seen.
Thank you very much, Al. I look forward to reading that book, and thank you so much for the presentation. It put me in mind of my grandparents, all of whom came from Eastern Europe between 1902 and 1906. And they had been influenced by socialist ideas before they came. They were teenagers when they came, but And then they went on to join, in their case, the Jewish groups in New York that were socialists and pre-party formations. We're going to take a short break for Jean to talk about upcoming speakers, and then we'll begin our question and discussion hour. So, Jean, please go ahead.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Al. You've given us a lot to think about and talk about a topic that very few of us knew very much about. So I'm sure we're going to have a very good and comradely discussion, which we concentrate on here. Okay, but we have some other good programs coming up. Let me put on my glasses here. Next week, October 23rd, Midwestern Marx comes to Northern California. We're fortunate and we're going to have a group of young people, young whippersnappers coming in to talk to us about some interesting things. It's going to be a somewhat different format because there's going to be two kind of interrelated presentations. The first will be the comprehensive crisis in the US and the revolutionary way forward. That will be one topic, and then that will be followed by another, the crisis of American healthcare post-COVID-19. So those will be a couple of interesting things. It'll be a somewhat different format, but I'm sure it'll be good to talk to some young people about their presentations also, and their views about what's going on. Following that, October 30th, we have our very own Raj Sahai will be speaking on the challenge of Alexander Dugin, whose daughter, you recall, was recently assassinated in Russia, on the fourth political theory, which some folks will believe will supplant communism. So anyway, we have some good topics coming up, and so it's back, and you can again sign up for our regular weekly announcements on our website, ICSSmarx.org. And back to you, Sharon.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jean. Richard, do you want to say something about our finances?
No.
No. We can always use donations. If you'd like to send one, please do. Let's leave it at that. So now we're going to have question Q&A. Please raise your hand if you're on Zoom, and we will call on you as in order. Raj is going to help me because I'm having trouble reading all the names on the Zoom screen in front of me. So if I don't see any hands yet, but oh, we do have one.
That's Mike Gilbert.
Mike Gilbert, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much for a really interesting presentation. And I have to confess, I'd never heard of this chap. I've read quite a lot of works by Marx and Friedrich Engels, and that's really the point I want to ask you. Really, I'm always fascinated to read the various critiques that Marx makes of other socialists, because it reveals so much about Marx and Engels' theory, how he critiques what other people are presenting as their form of socialism or their version of socialism. And we've got another individual here who similarly seems to have, sort of crossed swords with Marx in one sense, and they found themselves in a period of disagreement. Are there any published critiques by Marx of Willich or vice versa that you're aware of that I can perhaps have a look at?
Well, in a way that's kind of difficult to respond to, because all these in the comprehensive works of Marx and Engels in their volumes,
Yeah.
The comments concerning the debate about Willich are all published, at least all the writings that Marx and Engels did concerning Willich. But I cannot pinpoint those to you. You'd have to go through an index of those works looking for, the name Willich, and that would indicate the articles that Marx wrote concerning him. That's the only answer, I'm sorry, I can give you. But you did mention, it struck a point to me just now in your question, and that is something that I omitted, which was kind of significant, but which showed the intensity of personal animosity between the two. At one particular point, Willich was so insulted by what Marx said about him, he challenged Marx to a duel. And Marx refused. He had challenged Engels. Of course, Engels probably would have taken him up because Engels was a little bit more adventuresome and worldly than Marx. But a young follower of Marx said, if Marx won't do it, I'll do it. So this guy had never handled a pistol before. So you can imagine what might happen. He and Willich faced off. Willich shot him in the head, but unfortunately only grazed his head. So it just knocked him out and he recovered later. But that would indicate the intensity of it. And this incidentally was not the only duel among Marxists and socialists in England. The last duel between two political rivals who were in the communist camp was in England. And one of the persons was killed in this duel. Now, I forget their names, but anyhow, for historical reasons, just mention that. But I'm sorry, the best you can do is to look up Willich in Marx's various volumes.
Yeah, I'll go and have a look. I've got them all here.
Thank you. Jean, you're next.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Al. Again, it's good to see you and hear you again, and we hope you'll be making more presentations in the future. And it's good to see a fellow ex-Marine there, but I have to confess, I wasn't one of those gung-ho Marines. As soon as I got in, I wanted to get out, but I was too afraid to ask them to let me out because I knew what they did to people. So at any rate, I very much appreciate that discussion. And one of the other people, one of the other 48ers that is of interest were the Corbel brothers, who immigrated about the same time and founded a winery that makes, to this day, very good champagne on the banks of the Russian River. So again, a lot of important things went on at that time. But I don't know, it's good to look at everything that was involved in that Civil War back then. And as we are entering what we might call an uncivil war at the present time, do you have any comments on what's going on, bringing it up to the present, and in terms of what's going on and what's, our nation is divided like it's been, never been since the Civil War back in 1865. So anyway, those are my comments. If you care to address them, fine. But anyway, again, thanks for a very interesting talk.
Okay, thanks, Gene. It's a little bit off topic to get into this, and I really would like to stay on topic, but I will mention that about November, December, prior to January 6th, I did predict there would be some major armed conflict in the United States. And I based this on reading, which I read a lot of white supremacist literature online, and a lot of talk about a civil war. And when the governor, when they attempted to kidnap the governor of Michigan, okay, that just confirmed it more to me. And I was telling friends in December, I said, we are entering a period of low-level armed conflict. And don't be surprised if something happens. Yeah, I was kind of surprised by January 6th, but not too surprised. But yeah, I believe that we are in a period of electoral, legislative, street demonstrations, and armed conflict going into the future. And how this will be resolved, I don't know. But I just have how should I say, that was my estimate of what's going on now.
Thank you. And as usual, I still have my settle for Biden cup.
Raj is next.
Okay, thank you, Al. Really informative, learned a lot. This part of history I didn't know of the United States. So my question is the difference between Marx and Willich, which separated them. The idea, and I couldn't quite, because my attention was wavering because of my technical responsibility, is when was it that it must have been around 1848 that the differences arose, or was it much later?
No, it was after, it was when Willich went to London and Marx and Engels were already in London. Okay, and Willich joined the Communist League, of which Marx and Engels were part of them there. And Willich, as I said, that there's actually two aspects to this. Willich eventually agreed with Marx on Marxist political economy. Willich read Capital, he agreed with it, okay? Where he disagreed was with Marx's theory of revolution, okay? Again, when I first became aware of Willich, when I was preparing a presentation for the Academy of Military Science in China. And they asked me to speak, to speak about Engels and so forth. Okay? And one of the things I noticed was that Engels, although he was in the army of Willich, he disagreed with Willich's idea that a revolution simply meant that you take a workers' army and you march into Germany without any preparation except the preparation of forming the troops. Okay? And Engels wrote to Wiedemeyer, and he said, "Can you tell me some sources for me to read about the military? Because I don't really believe that, but I need to know more about the military, what their capabilities are or are not, and the conditions under which they should become involved in forming a workers' army and in, overthrowing directly a capitalist regime." Wiedemeyer, of course, had served with Willich, and in the meantime had gone to the United States. So Willich sends him back a bunch of, Wiedemeyer sends Engels back a bunch of material. And what was significant about this in discussing Engels' military thought is that this was the impetus for Engels to become involved in the study of the military and war. And that's how I first heard about Willich. He said Willich just believes in an adventuristic kind of attack, right? And he said revolution involves a lot more. He said, but I really want to know what the role of the army should be. Okay, that's how I first learned about Willich. Okay, and then I just pursued it afterwards.
Yeah, okay, but just to follow up, may I follow up?
Of course.
Yeah. So the interesting thing is that his idea in different ways, Willich's idea was carried out in Cuba, although it was a peasant army, but actually this is what Fidel and Che actually accomplished in Cuba and overthrew Batista with the United States in his support, although it was, I think the US wasn't clear about it, and they got lucky in some ways. But Willich's idea was followed, looks like, by Fidel and Che, successful. Where Marx and Engels seem to have disagreed. To you, in your opinion, who was right in that? Was Willich right? Was Marx and Engels correct about Germany, about the attack?
The answer is in the results. And the results are that Willich failed twice, and no other proletarian army in Germany succeeded. And that was because the bulk of the German population was not behind them. All right. And Marx's idea, of course, would be to organize people to get behind them. And in order to do that, they had to deal with the conditions of the people and try to better those conditions. And as they got better, eventually resistance would come up, and the resistance would reach a point where, as Engels said, the state would attack the successfully moving workers. And at that point, that's when the state physically attacked them, that's when the workers' army should be put into action.
So that's then successful Russian Revolution kind of meets that criteria of population ready to support the workers' insurrection. That's what
Yeah,
you're saying.
but
Okay.
I mean, the Willich eventually, after he spent some time in the United States, he concluded that most Germans were really not behind that kind of how should I say, military assault. Okay, there were some. I mean, there were a few thousand Germans that were, but there were tens of thousands of Germans in the army that had more support, or if not support, then how should I say, resignation by the rest of the German population.
Thank you. Next is Norma.
Hi. Hello. I have, as usual, a bunch of brilliant comments in the chat, and I refer you there. For those, they might impel further conversation. I had about 3 or 4 of them in mind. Raj, I was kind of disappointed at your question, since the obvious was what, what's his name? Who's the person speaking? Al, thank you. So stupid. But that's the state of my mind, and that's really how it is. It's unfortunate. Well, I don't know. It's okay. The obvious was the result, and I'm sure you know that the British are a ward by lining people up facing forward and shooting, and then the line of them would get shot at, and the result would be that if there were survivors, that was a victory of some sort. And you know that. I was surprised at your question. But couple of things, as I said in the chat, don't call anybody whippersnappers. In fact, don't call them young either. Oh, that young lady over there. There's 2 things going on. The young is a denigrating, putting a person in a denigrating position. And lady, of course, is not authorized by the Queen. And so the person is, and doesn't need to be identified by their gender unless somebody has the mind to engage in physically heterosexual relationship with them. So there's no need to resort to those terms, and I hope people get the idea. There's been so much activity around language. I know that's not you, Al. That is some implication about what's been said. And also my comments about teachers.
Can you come back to the discussion at hand, please?
I did.
Okay, thank you. Richard is next.
Well, let me have the, yeah, Al, your comment about the leadership style of the Union Army and the Communist Army in the Civil War, about the leadership style, reminded me that things haven't changed that much since then. I know I've seen discussions of the war in Ukraine, and of course the Ukrainian army is trained to NATO, i.e. US standards, and the Russian army is trained to Red Army standards, and the Ukrainian army, from what I've read, the officers are not in the front with the troops. They're in back and away from the action. And the Russians or the Donbass army, their officers are up with the troops. So things haven't changed that much in almost 200 years. The West Point whole standards, and it's interesting. I'm not asking you to comment, but I was reminded of that.
But you surely may comment if you'd like, Al.
Okay. This is one of those things that I really don't want to comment in detail on. I will say this, however. I am fairly well versed, not just in the former Soviet army, but in the contemporary Russian army. And if I was invited to speak on that in the context of Ukraine, I would be glad to. I was the capitalist political influence on the Russian army has been tremendous and has been, how should I say, a something that has held it back. I read where the CIA thought that the Russian army would be victorious within the week. I've heard people like Scott Ritter, who should know better, but say constantly about the greatness of the Russian army, its proficiency, its advanced strategy, and so on and so forth. I don't want to say that I know more than the CIA or Scott Ritter, but I read since at least the year 2000 Russian army reports on how they were trying to reform their military to bring it up to at least minimal NATO standards, and they have failed. The problems that they have had since the early 2000s, they were never able to overcome. And I say that it's a lot of detail, but I'd be glad to talk about it in another talk.
Thank you. Okay, we have Yusuf followed by Kathleen. Please go ahead, Yusuf.
Yes, thank you. A very good presentation. One comment to Raj, with all due respect, no challenges to a duel, which I'm incapable of. The view that the Cuban Revolution was done by just a small group of armed men and nothing else is rather simplistic, very simplistic. And there was like considerable agitation in the cities against Batista. The Fidelistas did very much organizing the peasants. They were very attuned to their needs. Now, again, with all due respect to Che, that's basically what he tried to do, is just thinking that a few armed men would be enough, and sort of neglected the advice of the local communists and so on and so forth of what the state of affairs was in Bolivia. So that's a comment. Also, the communists played a very important role in the Civil War, not just the example given by our esteemed speaker, but also Marx in England was very supportive of the Union. Prevented, there was mass movement of workers, even though they were somewhat at a, that the Union was a disadvantage. They were not getting the Southern cotton and potentially were losing jobs. They were supportive of the Union, prevented British and French intervention on behalf of the Confederacy. In contrast, the Proudhon advocated neutrality. He sent Bakunin to the US, but Bakunin wisely changed his mind and supported the Union. Okay, these are my comments, and I would welcome feedback.
Al's indicated he doesn't have any feedback at the moment.
I don't have an answer for him or a comment on his comments. I have another comment, however,
Go ahead.
and that is based upon what I said at the very end of my presentation. Jean mentioned that little is known about this. And my point was not just to talk about Willich as a military leader, but Willich as part of a larger German communist and socialist movement, which brought socialism and communism to the United States in the 1800s. When I talk with a lot of my comrades, they know a tremendous amount about the American communist movement, but they began in maybe 1905, 1917, right? No, the American communist movement began in the 1800s. And not to know that is to blot out an important part of our political history.
Yes, thank you for that. Kathleen, you're next. You have to unmute Kathleen.
Okay, I wanted to make a similar comment, maybe the same one that Yusuf did about Cuba. And I wanted to ask Raj why he thinks Cuba followed like the village idea of how you bring about a revolution. I mean, the Cubans were organizing and organized for a long time before 1959. There was massive resistance ongoing. There was massive repression from the state. And then after some failed attempts, the guerrillas did march in and take over. So I'm wondering why Raj thinks that, and then maybe afterward Al could comment, and then later I'll have another question for Al.
I posed that as a question to Al, so it's appropriate Al answered it. I didn't suggest that it was. I said, did Cuban Revolution follow the Willich what idea of capturing power using the peasants in that case, primarily peasant army, whereas it was Marx and Engels' idea was, Willich's idea was a workers' army, right, in Europe. And so Marx and Engels, and Al has already answered that they were not ready because the German people were not ready. So let Al address that question about Cuba if you want to ask. No.
No, that takes me too far afield from my talk. So if you have another question, shoot.
Well, I don't think it takes you far afield. It's like, could we apply Willich's notion of bringing about a revolution? I mean, let's try to apply it somewhere, like to Cuba. So that's not that far off. Do you think? I guess you think it is.
Well, I think that that Willich's idea was not replicated in Cuba. Okay, you can pick up a lot of national liberation struggles in which the focus is armed struggle, but at the same time, armed struggle is either used for or as part of a larger struggle for organizing people. If you recall, in Cuba, there were those in the cities that were organizing. University students, workers, and others were organizing in the cities at the same time that Castro and Fidel were in the countryside fighting. So I see that it's a little bit different than from what Willich was trying to do.
I think that, more than a century, almost a century and a half later, we have some lessons that we can all agree on, which is that you can't simply surround the cities from the countryside with armed forces and expect to have a successful revolution. You have to have mass movements everywhere of working people to support any kind of military action against monarchy or whoever you're trying to overthrow. So we don't need to go back. Well, it's interesting historically to go back and look at the mindset of people back then who were arguing these two sides. But we don't have to say, well, then those two sides are now here still represented in the same way, with the same ideas. We have a lot of history that we can draw lessons from. And even though we have many different ideas among socialists these days, we probably have some basic unity around that one. I see only one hand, Jean. So if there's no one else who hasn't yet spoken, I will call on Jean. Go ahead.
Okay, well, since no one else is on the list, I just want to jump in a little bit here again, bringing it up more to the present day, because very important, let's not forget the influence of Lenin here who really transformed revolutionary theory. And this is true of the great socialist revolutions of the 21st century, of the 20th century in both Russia and then China. But also the Cuban Revolution is a little bit anomalous there, but there's some question about whether Cuban Revolution would have survived had it not been for the support from the Soviet Union. So again, if we're going to talk about revolutionary theory and revolutionary practice, I think we need to also bring Lenin into the picture. And I'm not sure if that gets a little bit beyond the strict topic we talked about, but I think it is relevant in view of the continuing discussion. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see anyone else on the queue. I just wanted to say that I think what you're bringing forth is very, very important in terms of our history, Al. And the Communist Party actually, when it finally formed and moved forward, a lot of their base was in national groupings. So we have Finn Hall here in Berkeley because the Finnish comrades had their own groups. And it was certainly true all over the country. Different national origin groupings came together and they were part of the base of the communist movement. And we should recognize that. I also recall that in the movie Gangs of New York, there's a scene of men being grabbed off the boats and conscripted into the Union Army. And I wonder, do you know how true that is? Was that the way they did that, or?
I don't know if that's literally true. Okay. My only understanding of that in New York City was that they were conscripted, not as they got right off the boat, but were conscripted after they moved into those ethnic neighborhoods. Okay, that the Union Army went around and they recruited them. All right, it was a little bit more formal than just taking them off the gangplank.
Okay, thank you. Raj has his hand up.
Yeah, Al, you mentioned something that I was quite surprised to hear. I didn't know that of the Union Army's constitution, what was the constituent parts? You said 200,000 were German, 150,000 were black, and then there were less.
180,000.
Sorry, 180,000. Okay, and then it went down from there.
Yeah.
So the white Yankee Army was fewer numbers than these two numbers. That what was the total strength of that? Because ultimately they won. The Union Army defeated, and in which the Germans played a very significant role. I just want you to elaborate a little bit on that.
Okay.
Part.
Well, you have to remember that still during that time that the United States was getting immigrants, right? So they had more men to move into the Union Army. At the time, like they had Irish regiments, they had Scandinavian regiments, they had Italian regiments, they even had Native American regiments, which is, again, a topic that not many people know about, because Native Americans actually fought on both sides. But the Yankees, or the native born of native born, which I consider Yankees, they were, I don't know what the percentage of them was, but if you added up all the ethnic immigrant regiments, okay, that they were approximately equal in number. Okay, but I just don't have the figures off my head. So that they were, they were there. And in fact, I did not mention that towards the end of the war that Willich commanded a brigade, and in the brigade there were German, Irish, and Yankee regiments. But I'd have to look up material to find out, exactly the numbers.
Thank you. Next is Janet. And
Yeah,
Janet.
okay, thank you. So a few things. First, Scott Ritter, you mentioned him, and he has subsequently admitted that he was wrong about saying that the Ukraine conflict would be over in a week. So I have two questions. One, I don't remember you're talking about your own military background. Were you ever in the military? The other question has to do with, you're talking about that there's low grade or like Civil War kind of division within the United States right now. Low grade violence or activity. I was curious to know how you, I'd like you to expand on that. I mean, who would be fighting against who? I mean, it wouldn't be probably states seceding, but I guess, I don't know, are you talking about militias? Are you talking about, I'm wondering what the US military, is there a division? Do you see a division within the US military? Would it be fighting within the United States? What would that look like? I'm done.
Okay. What it would look like, it requires a certain amount of speculation on my part. But let me go back to what you first said and then just make a couple of comments relevant to your second question. I spent 6 years in the Marines. Why I predicted, if you want to call it that, the conflict that occurred on January 6th was because I felt that by the year before then, that there was a low-level conflict going on, some of which did involve people becoming armed, and that was evident with the Oath Keepers, which was brought out recently in the congressional hearings, that they came to DC with weapons. As I said, I keep track of these folks on their websites. I was watching very intently as to the kinds of things that they were saying, their belief in a civil war that they were talking about is kind of vague. I mean, it was against the government, but they were talking about having members sent into the police, their members sent into the police force, sent into the military, and that these folks would receive the kinds of training that was needed for them to participate in a stronger armed struggle. And their concept, outside talking about getting rid of the liberals, getting rid of the socialists, very kind of vague kinds of things. their focus was really on dealing with the government. And I can't predict what the future would be like, other than this kind of thing is going to continue, because I see it continuing, continuously being spoken about on these websites. For a time after January 6th, they were kind of subdued, but then they started to talk more about it more recently. With the U.S. military, what would they do? The military was kind of given a choice around just before January 6th, and where the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was talking about Trump initiating the Insurrection Act, which would have brought the military in and create something like a what do you call it? When you lock down everything. Not a state of siege, but
Martial law?
martial law, right? Okay, sorry. All right, creating martial law, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was doing his best to convince Trump not to do that, and he went around and told all the other and got the agreement of all the other chiefs, that is the head of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and so forth, that they would, if Trump did this, they would step down and they would refuse to participate in any kind of act like that. And at this point, I believe that the top brass is still, with a few exceptions, but the vast majority are committed to proceeding on a constitutional basis, where they support what's in the Constitution rather than whoever happens to be the president. Whether there would be a divided military on this, because we know that many of the persons who participated in June 6th were either police or military or ex-military. It just at this point, I don't think that the forces that would advocate some kind of armed struggle are in a position to do so right now. Whether they'll be in a position to do so in the future, maybe.
Thank you. I just wanted to add that we have in our midst some people who, in my opinion, are heroes of the anti-war movement, and Al is one of them. Trying to organize within the military was very difficult, to say the least. And it's very, very important. And of course, going forward is going to be very important. And we also have our friend Gary Hicks, who is ill right now. Gary went to prison rather than be drafted. Probably that was because he's Black. If he had been white, and refused the draft, he might not necessarily have gone to prison. But in any case, he's another one of my heroes. I myself am a veteran of the streets of Washington, D.C. during the anti-war movement. And on January 6th, I was screaming at the television, where's the tear gas? Where's the National Guard that they brought down on us when we were peacefully sitting in on the streets of Washington? And in my personal opinion, if the governor of Maryland had 1 ounce of courage, he would have sent the National Guard down New York Avenue without waiting for whatever he was waiting for from the Pentagon. And this week we saw the scene from within the secret area of the Capitol where Schumer was begging the Pentagon for the National Guard. So that contradiction has been exposed. And I think, luckily, that we know about it. But I definitely agree that some people don't agree with this, that it was an attempted insurrection, and they probably learned a lot from it. You know, they probably, you know, we've heard them say, you know, people from the Oath Keepers, oh, well, we shouldn't have left the guns in Virginia, right? They had them stored back over the bridge. We need to learn a lot from that scene as well. The next person in the queue.
Wait. So this is Janet. The camera, I assume that was you, Sharon, who was speaking.
Yes, I'm sorry.
The camera continues to show the guest and not you.
Yeah,
Anyway,
I know.
okay.
Because we're having trouble with the Zoom isn't picking up the speaker.
Okay.
from-
That's it. Thanks.
Yeah, that was me. Sharon. Did you want to say anything more, Janet?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to add something a little bit more. I did say there was a second component of this, and that is the attempt to take over the state legislatures, city school boards,
Yes.
and things like this. And that is a second component of this particular struggle of attempting to create what I think is a movement towards a fascist state. There may be a lot of steps between now and that kind of state. And it all depends on whether these movements, whether they are done through elections or whether they're done through direct actions, whether they will be successful or not. And it's up to the rest of us to prevent them from being successful.
Thank you, Al. Next on the queue is Norma. Go ahead, Norma.
The effect of mothers of Russian soldiers is very strong. They really don't want their children to die in wars, no matter how well-intentioned the wars are. And that began, as far as I can remember, about Afghanistan. Do you remember the soldiers were dying, and it didn't seem as though it was able to go any place about Afghanistan, and the mothers began organizing and saying, don't do this anymore. Another thing is, I've only recently read some information broadening my understanding. In Russia, there were extensive pre-Soviet combinations of people throughout some area of land. I don't know just where, but they did exist, and they became eventually, I'm sure, part of the victory of the Soviet Revolution. This is not attainable here in the capitalist world. In the capitalist world, we are carefully divided and separated into these minute families, down to one parent, one child now. It used to be two parents, but it has strongly become one parent, one child. We are so divided that we have no semblance of pre-Soviet organizing in this country, and probably in many places. And although, of course, there are places where people are organizing, and whether that's going to prove to be a developing sound basis for us doing something en masse has yet to be imagined, let alone happen.
Yeah, let me make a quick comment on your Afghanistan comment. It's absolutely true. Afghanistan was for the Soviet Union what Vietnam was for the United States. I could go into a lot of detail about drug addiction among the troops there, about how they were even selling weapons to the Afghans. That is, the Russian soldiers would sell weapons to Afghans to get money to buy drugs. There was a lot of turmoil, a lot of conflict. Officers were being shot by their men, just like happened in Vietnam. I was in the Soviet Union in 1987, and there was a play that was going on in Moscow, which depicted the mothers who were trying to get the soldiers out of Afghanistan. And so that's true. The mothers played a major role in that struggle. As for the United States, I've always often thought that the United States is one of the most difficult places to organize. Sometimes it is successful on certain issues, but if you're talking about mass organizations to confront capitalism as a whole, I just don't see that as having happened to any significant extent at this point since maybe the 1930s. So I agree with you on that particular point about the divisions within this country and so forth. If my speculation is that when socialism comes to an advanced capitalist country, it'll not be in the United States, it'll be in another capitalist country, and that will reverberate back to the United States. But that, again, is just a speculation.
Thank goodness for the rest of the world, which is often not recalled when we are thinking about how the world works.
We have two more speakers, and then I'm going to let Al have the last word if he wants to. He's already had a lot of last words. But okay, so Janet and then Raj, and then Al will be the final. Go ahead, Janet.
Okay, so I just wanted to ask about the 70s or the 60s, sorry, the organizing in the 60s. Can you comment on that in the United States against the Vietnam War, and the women's movement, et cetera, all that? You said the 30s, but it was the last.
All right, well, the 30s was a different type of, well, the 60s was organizing around the Vietnam War. There were other struggles in campuses among women and so forth, but these struggles tended to end. For example, when the Vietnam War ended, these struggles did not coalesce and continue on. The struggles in the 30s were more around economic issues, trade unionism, the Depression, which were direct confrontations with the capitalist class. That was not the case so much during the 1960s. For example, when I was organizing with soldiers and sailors during the 60s, the level of organizing among them, in my view, was one of the major reasons for the United States to get out of Vietnam, because by 1970, you couldn't trust the military anymore. But that all died out after the war. I mean, the war kind of like, okay, the war is over, no more organizing among the military. The military was smart enough to end the draft so that they wouldn't get a whole bunch of folks in there on a non-voluntary basis, which were potential recruits for an anti-war movement. And the same thing kind of like in Russia today. When I read the Russian press, and both the mainstream and the independent Russian press, and you find hundreds of thousands of persons leaving Russia. A lot of them they don't object to the war. A lot of them are neutral to the war, but they sure as hell object to being mobilized into the war because they don't want their ass shot. And so, you know, you find this anti-mobilization movement, right, similar to the anti-mobilization movement in the United States. A lot of the persons who didn't, who were supposedly identified as against the Vietnam War, well, you know, they might have very well not complained if there was no draft, and they would not have had to go. I mean, how many, you know, we don't have the draft now. How much of a anti-war movement do we see?
But then you also have the civil rights movement, and you had, you know, like Malcolm X, the ballot or the bullet. You had MLK coming out against the war, and there was militancy in that respect. And I mean,
While we're considering that, Kim White has a,
excuse me,
well, hold on. Kim White has a note in the chat you might do.
I'm sorry, but we have to keep some order here. Actually, I'm not sorry. We do have to keep some order, and we're going to go according to who the chair calls on. So the next person in the queue is Raj.
So Al, we're sort of already getting away from the topic. So we're into the topic of what threatens the United States presently, the order here, about insurrection from the right versus protection of constitutional democracy from the left and liberals. But the problem is this: liberalism is precisely how we've gotten to this point. In other words, liberalism is associated with capitalism. That is its ideology. Okay, and eventually that has reached a point where half the people in the United States are very badly off. And they have been retracted to the right wing because the left did not offer them an alternative, or at least were unsuccessful. So the question here in Ukraine is not whether the Russians can fight. For Russians, I think there may be 100, 200, 300,000 people who want to leave rather than fight. That's fine. But Russia is much bigger than that. And they see this not like Vietnam War. This is for them a survival issue. Ukraine is too important for them, so they will fight. Question is ours. The left, whatever influence they have, and the left is always important, even if small. In your opinion, it seems like you're saying side with the liberals against the right wingers because they pose a greater threat to constitutional democracy, or am I reading it wrong?
Okay, Al, you get to have the last word in answering that and anything else you want to say.
It's a perennial question, given the weakness of the socialist left. When on their own, they have largely failed to organize a mass movement. And so they tended to turn to the liberal left, or to the liberals, in order to gain support. And that creates a quandary, right? Because you're going into the hands of, or trying to unite with somebody that, you know, when you reach a certain point, they're going to turn against you also. That happened right after World War II with the liberals turning against the communists when the communists were organizing with the liberals. Okay, so I have no answer for that, other than that the socialist left has to get their act together. That's all I can say. Now, if you want to give me the last word on this, what I hope is that you not only recognize the importance of a person like Willich, who carried communist ideas into the United States, but you recognize him in conjunction with a minority of immigrants, like I say, maybe about 15,000 out of a couple of million, who had a very great impact on creating a socialist movement. And not only did they create all kinds of three-party formations and communist leagues and so forth, but they were also instrumental in creating the first two national socialist parties in the United States, Socialist Liberal Party and the Socialist Party. The German communists and socialists were instrumental in creating those organizations, although people talk about Eugene Debs, right? Or they talk about De Leon for the Socialist Labor Party, but there were far more 48ers, far more German communists and socialists who were organizing these kinds of groups. And so my whole point is that there were high points in American history, which we should recognize, we should study, and see if we can learn any lessons from them.
Okay, thank you so much, Al. We're going to turn off the recording now.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses, since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums. Please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, at yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/NPML. For information, write to NPML at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.